We don't know who he was, where he came from, or where he went.
In my last video, I tackled one of the theories that never seems to go away, which is this theory that Cooper never really jumped and instead hid on the plane. In this video, I'll discuss another oddball theory that comes up from time to time, which is this theory suggesting that the crew were in on it and that they knew Cooper or that Cooper never really existed in the first place. So, were the crew in on it?
No way. It never happened. It never happened. It's false. It never happened. It's an urban legend that never happened. No way. Not a chance.
Precisely. And hopefully this is the last time I will ever have to talk about this.
The line must be drawn here. This far, no farther.
Honestly, I could probably end the video there, as just a smidge of common sense would lead one to understand how preposterous this theory really is. However, I figured I may as well at least discuss it a little bit, since the FBI did actually conduct a short investigation into this theory. First off, let's give a bit of background on the flight crew. The captain that day was 51-year-old William Scott. Everyone called him Scotty, even his kids. The Cooper hijacking was not his first time flying under stressful conditions. During World War II, he had been a pilot and actually flew 62 missions in the Pacific Theater during the war. By 1971, he was in his 25th year with Northwest and was one of their most senior pilots. The co-pilot that day was William "Bill" Radachek. He was 32 and spent most of his life around Northwest Airlines. His father had been a crew chief for the company since 1942. During high school and then later in college at the University of Minnesota, Radachek worked odd jobs at the Northwest Airlines hub in Minneapolis, such as washing casserole dishes in the food service kitchen, polishing airplanes, and even as a baggage handler. He eventually studied to become a pilot, and by 1971 he was in his 6th year of flying for Northwest. The flight engineer that day was 37-year-old Harold Anderson. Like the others, he too was a Northwest company man and had been with them for many years. As for the cabin crew, they were led by senior stewardess Alice Hancock from Minnesota. She was 24 and had been with Northwest for about 4 years. Very petite, she had just barely met the minimum height requirement of 5'2". Next was Florence Schaffner, 23 years old and in her 3rd year with the company. Originally from Arkansas, Schaffner was a former cheerleading captain and beauty pageant winner. She was Cooper's first choice to be his go-between with the outside world, and it was she who would receive his initial hijacking note. Sitting next to Cooper, he displayed the bomb to her and forced her to write down his ransom demands. When she took these to the cockpit, she was apparently a bit shaken up by the whole thing, and the pilots kept her up there until they landed in Seattle. The pilots, being gentlemen, never discussed this publicly, but my sense is that she may have been crying, and they didn't want to send her back into the cabin where passengers could see her visibly distressed. Finally, we come to Tina Mucklow, who is certainly the most famous member of the crew, as she spent the most time with Cooper. She was 22 years old at the time and was from a North Philadelphia suburb. During high school, she was an exceptional student and was student council president. But she passed on college to join the airline industry. Like many young women at the time, she viewed being a stewardess as a chance to see the world and to be paid nicely to do so. On that particular flight, she was working with Schaffner in the tourist cabin, which is what most of us would probably call coach. When Schaffner took Cooper's demands to the front, Cooper kept looking up the aisle, waiting for her to return. When there was no sign that Schaffner was actually going to come back, he turned his gaze to Mucklow. She instinctively understood that she was needed and took a seat next to him, which is where she would remain throughout much of the hijacking. Once they landed in Seattle and the money and the parachutes were brought aboard, Cooper let Schaffner and Hancock go, but he kept Mucklow, claiming he needed her assistance to help him with the aft stairs. But within 5 minutes after takeoff from Seattle, Cooper sends Mucklow to the front, and that was the last time any crew member actually saw Cooper. Okay, so now that we have that background of the crew out of the way, let's look at this silly conspiracy theory. The gist of the theory is that the flight crew were all in cahoots together, and in particular that Bill Radachek played the role of Cooper. Oftentimes when people are new to the Cooper case, you'll see them post on message boards or Reddit or Facebook that they have a theory that Cooper either didn't jump and hit on the plane, or that he never existed at all and this was all some work by the crew. Well, the recent release of the FBI files tells us that there is truly nothing new under the sun, because both of those theories were submitted to the FBI by the public within 1 week of the hijacking. So as for this theory about the flight crew being in on it, the first time we see it in the FBI files is on November 29, 1971, just 5 days after the hijacking. An individual called the FBI office in Olympia, Washington, after he determined that there was a resemblance between the sketch of the hijacker and that of co-pilot Bill Radachek. This guy also told the FBI that he thought the crew was a bit too cooperative with the hijacker. With this tip being received within a week of the actual hijacking, case agents were busy following other leads and tracking down other things, and they just ignored it. Then, in June 1973, FBI headquarters in D.C. received a letter from a tipster promoting this theory, and once again specifically singling Radachek out. But instead of dismissing it outright, headquarters actually sent a memo to the Seattle FBI office inquiring about the feasibility of this theory. Agents in Seattle responded that it wasn't feasible for many reasons. First, for Radachek to have played the role of Cooper as part of some huge conspiracy would mean that all 6 members of the crew were in on it. In conspiracies as large as 6 people, there will always be discrepancies in their various stories, yet all of the crew testimonies were consistent about the events. Next, the witness descriptions of Cooper provided by the passengers matched up with the descriptions of Cooper provided by the stewardesses. If the stewardesses were trying to protect one of their own, their description likely would have varied from the passengers insofar as trying to confuse the authorities. Finally, agents pointed out that the pressure bump reported by the crew, which indicated the hijacker's jump from the aft stairs, was not something that they could have predicted would occur since it had never happened before. Therefore, it was not a detail that they would have known that they needed to include in their story. Nevertheless, as part of their due diligence investigating this possibility, agents in Minneapolis were asked to discreetly interview Northwest personnel about Radachek. The response from Northwest was immediate. They said it was not only a preposterous suggestion to begin with, but that Radachek himself was considered a man of great character. Also, one of these Northwest employees that the FBI spoke with explained that he was listening to the hijacking in real time and that Radachek's voice was clearly heard throughout the event, making it impossible that he could have been in the rear posing as Cooper. This is certainly true, as we do have audio from the hijacking, and it's clearly Radachek's voice on those recordings.
We have one more request. We ask those passengers to go back on the taxi strip between the 2 runways. There's no reason for them to be standing there. They're only going to create confusion and some apprehension, so please direct those passengers to move back about 200 yards onto the common taxiway, please.
Okay, on to some other reasons why this theory is silly. Radachek was the spokesman for the crew with the media. If he was Cooper, then no doubt the passengers who saw Cooper would have just said, "Oh, wait, that's the guy right there."
We felt, in this specific situation, that we had his confidence. We felt he was assured that we were honoring his requests, and therefore we made no attempt to impede his the completion of his mission, if you will.
Another important thing to point out is that all of the crew had great jobs and loved their jobs. After the hijacking, they all continued to spend years and even decades in the industry. They were also well-paying jobs. Stewardesses made very good money and were among the highest-paying jobs for young women at the time. The starting salary for a Northwest stewardess in 1971 was right around $500 a month, which in today's dollars is about $4,000. So for a young woman who was 21 or 22 to have a job that allowed them to see the world, have their expenses paid, and start out making a yearly salary of about $50,000 in today's money, being a stewardess was a heck of a job back then. For the flight crew, after you adjust for inflation, they were making around $125,000 a year starting out. And a guy like Captain Scott, he would have been making about $250,000 or higher in today's money. So with all members of the flight crew having well-paying jobs, why would they risk a lifetime in prison for what would essentially be 1 or 2 years' salary after they divided it 6 ways? So this whole theory is just really nonsensical. Another variant of this theory that you see popping up from time to time is this notion that the crew as a whole weren't in on it, but that Tina Mucklow was some sort of willing conspirator with Cooper. Let me just debunk that one right quick. Recall earlier that I mentioned how Florence Schaffner was Cooper's first choice to be his go-between with the flight crew. If Mucklow was in on it, then Cooper would have just handed the note to her in the first place. Cooper had no way of knowing that Schaffner would be kept in the cockpit by the flight crew and that Mucklow would be the one to handle all of his communications and be the one to ferry all of his ransom demands aboard. So that just doesn't make any sense at all to suggest that Tina Mucklow was in on it. I think a lot of these online conspiracy theories directed at the crew, and against Mucklow in particular, are derived from the crew's reticence to give interviews until recently, as if their lack of public statements is somehow a silent admission that they were hiding something. But of course that's just nonsense. As the primary witnesses to an active law enforcement investigation for 45 years, they wisely kept a low profile throughout much of that time. Many today view Cooper as this lovable rogue type, like he's Han Solo in a business suit, but that is not at all how his victims, like Florence Schaffner or Tina Mucklow, viewed him. He threatened their lives in a very real way that day. Cooper repeatedly threatened to blow the plane up and told them many times that no matter what occurred, he was not going to be taken alive. And Florence Schaffner has stated that for many years, she lived in fear that he would come find her. With the gift of hindsight, we can look back on the events of November 24, 1971, knowing that none of the passengers or crew were killed or physically harmed. But on that day, no one aboard knew how it was going to play out. In that moment, it was a very frightening ordeal for them, as evidenced by Schaffner's reaction. Mucklow, to her credit, managed to maintain her composure during the hijacking, but as soon as it was over, she broke down and wept. In this photo of her leaving the plane, we can clearly see her carrying a wad of tissues. So I think it's very understandable why they kept a low profile for decades, and it's quite insulting to insinuate that they had anything to do with a crime that was perpetrated against them. Of course, only a tiny fraction of people with any interest in this case believe in such things. But I still felt compelled to debunk this stupid theory because it does pop up on occasion. Anyways, that's all I've got for today, so like and subscribe and all that YouTubey stuff, it really does help. I will talk to y'all again soon.